The only survivors of a plane crash stranded on an isolated snow-covered mountain must journey back to civilization. While one battles her personal demons, the other strives to keep them safe. Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is a 2023 mystery thriller titled Survive. The movie begins with Jane waking up suddenly after experiencing haunting visions from her past. She suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder with suicidal ideation. Jane's roommate and fellow patient, Kara, asks if she saw him again, referring to Jane's father. Kara claims that she was unable to sleep because she was sad about Jane leaving. Jane lives in a lifehouse, which is a home for people suffering from various types of mental disorders. The lifehouse has 36 beds, a pool, a private pharmacy, and many other facilities. It has been a year since she tried to kill herself by slitting her wrist, and now Jane is planning to return home. However, Kara suspects Jane is considering committing suicide on her way back. After taking a shower, Jane is advised by the housekeeper to be careful with the razor as a precaution. The housekeeper also mentions that suicide runs in their family, but Jane wants to be saved and loved. Later, at the pool, Jane meets a new girl who has burn marks all over her body. They bond over their shared traumas, as the new girl shares some of her struggles and the reasons why she is at the lifehouse. That night, Jane sneaks out of her room, claiming that if you stay at the lifehouse long enough, you learn everything, including the security code to the pharmacy. She then grabs a bunch of pills and rushes out upon hearing the sound of someone entering. The next morning, during a therapy session, a boy named Phil, who deliberately cuts himself, reveals that back in the day, doctors used to bleed people, believing that by cutting a patient, they could pull the sickness out of them. He explains that this is what he was trying to do when he first cut himself. Jane, who is an influential figure, is invited to speak at the Lifehouse event. She shares that she is a planner and feels anxious when she doesn't know what to expect. She also reveals that she comes from a family with a history of suicides, not just her father, but also her grandmother killed herself. She believes that when she takes the flight back home tonight, only her body will reach home, but not her soul. Once everyone on the plane is asleep, she plans to make her way to the lavatory, take a handful of pills, and just sleep. It turns out Jane nodded off during her speech. Upon being asked again, she acknowledges that she's going to miss everyone and is grateful, but she doesn't want to come back to the lifehouse ever again. Later, Jane was on a call with her mother, who insisted on picking her up at the airport and had made plans for them to catch up. Upon hearing this, Jane pretended to have a breakdown and ended the call. Jane believed that her father was a narcissist for leaving her alone, but now she felt guilty about planning to do the same to her mother. She didn't know why her father took his own life, but the pain from losing him made her hurt herself. His death affected her so deeply that it took away all her happiness. But now that she understands what he must have been going through, she understands his reasons and is even willing to forgive him. Later, Jane packs up her bags and leaves for the airport. Just then, Kara rushes to the doctor and tells him that Jane intends to do something harmful to herself. At the airport, Jane receives a call from the lifehouse but chooses to ignore it. She then meets an engaged woman named Margaret, who is raving about her ring and her marriage. On the other hand, a friendly guy named Paul is struggling to get past security, so Jane breaks off the line to rush inside, catching Paul's attention with her behavior. Breathing heavily, Jane once again receives a call from the lifehouse, and upon being confronted, she turns the story around by telling the doctor that Kara is a compulsive liar. Hearing this news, Kara experiences a nervous breakdown and starts throwing things around, feeling betrayed by her friend while Jane cries, knowing the pain she has caused. Moments later, Paul knocks on the door and tells Jane that she's in the men's room. He even offers to keep her company, but she politely declines. When Jane exits, Paul checks up on her to see how she's doing. Sensing something is wrong with her, he asks to keep her company. Regardless, Jane thanks him for his sincerity and walks away. However, Paul lingers around, and soon they introduce themselves. After boarding the plane, Jane is surprised to see that they even have seats beside each other. While Paul likes to talk, Jane mostly keeps to herself. Later, Jane writes a note to Paul, telling him that her death isn't his fault, and that she is glad he was the last person she spoke to. She folds the piece of paper and slips it into Paul's pocket as he sleeps. Then she gets up to go to the bathroom, but bumps into a passenger on the way. Inside the bathroom, she takes out several bottles of pills, and contemplates whether she should end her life. Just then, turbulence hits, causing her to spill all the pills. As she scrambles to collect them, the flight attendant starts knocking on the door, urging her to return to her seat immediately. Moments later, the turbulence escalates into a critical situation. As the plane tosses and turns, the passengers brace for impact. Chaos and panic fill the cabin, with passengers screaming and holding onto their seats. Ultimately, the plane crashes into a remote, snow-covered mountainous area. The wreckage is scattered across the snow. Jane, disoriented and injured, emerges from the debris and sees dead bodies everywhere. Margaret, who was flaunting her engagement ring a while ago, dies in front of Jane's eyes. Horrified by the catastrophic disaster surrounding her, Jane yells for help, but no one is around to hear her. Soon, Jane finds Paul stuck in the wreckage and somehow manages to pull him out. Despite their injuries, they gather all the supplies they can find and take shelter in the lavatory. They make their way back into the plane, where it becomes clear that Paul might have broken his ribs. Struggling to stay warm, they share a sleeping bag to keep warm for the night. They then take inventory of their supplies, rationing them for the days they might have to spend in the wilderness. They manage to save a few bags of peanuts, pretzels, energy bars, water, a Swiss Army knife, gloves, and a flashlight. After spending the night inside the plane wreckage, Jane tries to get out the next morning, but the door seems to be jammed. She breaks it down and rushes out, trying to pull Margaret's body from the snow. Paul follows her out and asks if she knows the woman. In tears, guilt overwhelms Jane as she claims it should have been her body that Margaret was digging out. She then asks Paul to leave her stranded on the mountain and find a way out for himself. Despite her rude behavior, Paul, determined not to give up, convinces Jane they have to stick together to survive. He manages to get Jane back into the plane to warm up while he screams in frustration. Later, as Jane sits in the wreckage, she finds a bottle of her pills and a sharp piece of glass, which she keeps to herself. Soon, Paul shows up and tells Jane they need to start moving towards the mountains since a storm is coming and they are very exposed. He warns that it might take weeks for help to arrive. Hopeless, Jane asks him to leave without her, claiming she's fine with dying there. However, Paul refuses to give up. He forces Jane to gather her stuff and leave, threatening to take the only sleeping bag with him. But Jane couldn't care less, and she still insists on him leaving alone. Just as Paul starts walking away, the fear of being left alone settles in, and Jane begins to follow him. Along the trail, Jane apologizes to Paul for her behavior. After walking miles on snow-covered mountains, they arrive at a dead end. Paul reveals they have to climb down from this point, but Jane is reluctant. Paul mocks her, claiming that for someone who wants to die, this should be easy. He explains that they must descend into the valley, or they might freeze to death. Still hesitant, Jane follows him since she has no other option. Holding onto each other, they climb down the hills slowly and steadily. At one point, they arrive at a very narrow path. Paul makes it to the other side, but Jane is terrified. After Paul motivates her, she musters the courage, takes Paul's hand, and crosses over, only to discover there's no more path, and they can't move any further. With no other option, Paul jumps off the cliff, asking Jane to follow him. Upon finding out that Paul has landed safely, Jane jumps and lands right next to him. However, during the jump, Jane's bottle of pills falls out, and Paul confronts her. She admits that the pills were her way out, so Paul keeps them. Tired from walking, Jane wants to take a break, but Paul insists they keep moving. Just when things seem to be going fine, an avalanche hits, burying Jane under the snow. With a lot of digging and effort, Paul successfully manages to pull her out and takes her inside a cave opening. Time passes quickly, and soon it gets dark. It takes a few hours for Jane to regain consciousness, and the two of them spend the night inside the cave. During their conversation, Paul reveals that he intentionally changed his seat to sit beside her. This brings a smile to her face, and she tells Paul how she loved Christmas mornings as a child. She would wake up early, sneak downstairs, and open her presents, truly believing they were from Santa. That is, until one Christmas morning when she heard a gunshot from her dad's room. She hurried over only to find that he had killed himself. However, Paul believes she must also have some good memories of her dad, and Jane agrees. Her dad used to call her Pumpkin, and she misses that. She then shows Paul the pocket watch she got from her dad the night before he died. Paul believes that sometimes one bad memory weighs so heavily that 1,000 good memories seem to drift away. Jane appears to be angry with her father for committing suicide, but also blames herself. She believes she was too young to see the hole in his head. Paul reassures her that she was just a kid, and it was not her fault. During the tough night in the cave that mirrors her feelings of isolation and despair, Jane holds the broken piece of glass and is confronted with the choice between giving in to her suicidal thoughts or continuing to fight for survival. The sharp piece of glass that once terrified her is now just a piece of broken glass. The next morning, Paul is whimpering as his broken ribs cause him a lot of pain. His skin has turned purple and he can barely walk. Seeing Paul's condition, Jane decides to spend another day inside the cave. With Paul shivering from the cold and in pain, he asks Jane if they still have the pills, their way out of this situation. Though Jane still has the pills, she now has newfound inner strength and doesn't want a way out. Paul then reveals that as a 9-year-old child, he was not allowed to cry while his mother was dying, something he hated her for. At this point, Paul is on the verge of giving up. He believes they made a huge mistake by leaving the crash site, since no one will come to a snow-covered cave to save them. However, Jane looks at Paul and motivates him, telling him that they will make it out alive. Jane's strong will and positive attitude help Paul regain hope. Her confidence in their survival encourages Paul to keep going and fight to stay alive. In a heartfelt moment, they hug each other. The next morning, despite the overwhelming odds, their journey to survival begins again. After a small break, they get back on their feet. While trying to see if they have made it closer to the river, Paul loses his footing and slips. He falls down a cliff, tumbling uncontrollably over the edge. Jane is horrified and immediately rushes over to reach Paul, only to find his left arm severely injured. He asks Jane to grab a stick so they can splint the bones together. As Paul screams in pain, Jane rips off his jacket and uses the stick to create a splint, immobilizing his arm to prevent further damage. She then gives him sleeping pills to help with the pain. After walking a bit further, they settle in for the night. Jane reassures Paul that they're going to be okay. The next morning, Paul's body looks visibly frail. He weakens further to the point where he starts vomiting blood. Realizing he is going to die, Paul tells Jane she has to stay alive and must abandon him to continue the journey alone. After much convincing, Jane finally agrees. Before she leaves, she gives Paul the bottle of sleeping pills and asks him to take some if the pain becomes too much. Jane kisses Paul on the forehead and they part ways. Jane walks a long distance through the forest, battling the cold. Suddenly, she encounters a wolf. Jane runs as the wolf follows her aggressively in a desperate attempt to save herself. She climbs a tree and manages to scare the wolf away with a stick. Her second attempt to escape fails as the wolf eventually catches up to her. Knowing she doesn't have much energy left to outrun it, she decides to face the wolf head-on. She wraps her jacket around her forearm and watches the wolf furiously run towards her. As the wolf leaps at her, Jane holds out her forearm so it can grab onto her. She then uses the broken piece of glass she kept in her jacket to stab the wolf multiple times, killing it, but she ends up with deep wounds in the process. Feeling accomplished for what she thought was impossible, Jane gains the strength to continue her journey through the forest. After crossing the river, she makes her way out of the woods, but before she can reach the road, she passes out from pain and exhaustion. The scene changes, showing Jane screaming and calling for Paul. She then has flashbacks of the happy memories with her father. Jane gets a sense of closure as she processes her grief and begins to think of her future. The movie concludes with Jane waking up in a hospital in Montana, where she learns from her mother that the authorities found Paul the day after finding her. Sadly, Paul passed away, but he left a note expressing his happiness about their friendship and the time they spent together. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.